Good morning. My pleasure to be here today to chair this panel of able scholars to talk about issues that we all care about deeply. Our first presenter will be Maureen O'Hara, and she's the Robert Purcell Professor of Finance at the Johnson Graduate School of Management at Cornell. She also holds a professorship in Sydney. Her research focuses on issues of market microstructure, and she's the author of numerous articles as well as the book Market Microstructure Theory. I'll introduce all three at the beginning and then we'll carry on from there. Father Peter Schallenberg is professor of moral theology and ethics at the Faculty of Theology in Paderborn and director of the Catholic Social Science Center in Mönchengladbach. His research focuses on Christian social ethics, social market economy ethics, and Christian social theory. He's published numerous scholarly articles and books, including God, the Good and the Human, Fundamentals of Catholic Moral Theology. Martijn Cremers is professor of finance and currently the interim dean of the business school at Notre Dame, but we just heard this week that he will be the dean starting July 1st. His research focuses on empirical issues in investments and corporate finance. He's published many scholarly articles, including one about to appear, or maybe it already has, Martin, I'm not sure, that might interest you. We speak a lot in this conference about the common good, but this might appeal to your own narrow self-interest. The title of the article is How Active is Your Fund Manager? A New Measure That Predicts Performance. So, Maureen, may I ask you to begin?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's certainly a delight to be here, and I do want to thank Thomas and Michael and all the people who organized what I have found so far to be a really delightful conference. So thank you for including me. We don't have a clicker, so we're going to do this the old-fashioned way. Thank you. We're supposed to be, in this session, reconsidering the values of finance. And I think that makes a lot of sense when you think about the various things we've been asked to do. And for example, Pope Benedict, financiers must rediscover the genuinely ethical foundations of their activity so as not to abuse the sophisticated instruments which can serve to betray the interests of savers. I think that's a nice quote. It's one that I find very useful to contemplate because I do think we have to rediscover the ethical foundations of what we do. But if you're going to reshape the values in finance, I think you first have to understand why is finance the way it is? And that's tricky. Is it, as some people claim, for example, Richard Posner here at University of Chicago is in this camp, that the wrong sort of people go into finance, that people only interested in money, people only interested in a narrow world of whether they can take advantage of others because they know more. If those are the sorts of people who go into finance, then it's going to be pretty tough. But I don't think that's it. But then again, what else is there to blame? There's no question that finance has not fared well in the public opinion of how well we do with respect to ethical behavior. There are all kinds of polls and things that show that, were it not for Congress, we'd probably be down right at the bottom. So it's an interesting challenge, right? As someone who teaches MBAs and PhDs, as someone who works in the industry on boards and things, nobody wants to be part of a profession in any way, shape, or form that's viewed as fleecing people. So I think it's important, and I think we have to reshape the values. Now, as someone who's also taught for a long time, the 9 o'clock class, they're usually showing up, but they're not really all that awake yet. And so as the leadoff speaker, I thought I would take a slightly different approach here to try and think about the question I posed, which is, if it's not if it's not this, then what is it? So what I want to do is I want to show you two experiments. All right, so economics and finance have begun to draw on broader disciplines than we have in the past. Experimental economics is big. behavioral economics, behavioral finance is big, and I'm actually going to talk to you today a little bit about behavioral ethics. So I want to show you two experiments that people ran to try and sort of get at some features that may help us understand, what are the values and where do we have to go with this. So this cute little fellow, as you would guess, is a mouse. And the experiment I'm going to talk about was run in Europe by a group of experimental economists. And the point of this experiment is to understand how do people behave differently when they're in markets. So if you think about one of the things that characterizes modern finance, it isn't the handshake and lend you the money and you promise to pay it back. It isn't the we're doing this one-on-one. Virtually everything we do is in markets. Markets are impersonal, right? The problem with markets, or maybe the benefit of markets, is that because they're not generally, so geographically constrained, they allow finance to spread and do wonderful things. But they are markets. So I want to show you this experiment. So we'll go one more. And here's the experiment. The experimenters had a large group of people. They repeated this over and over again. So we'll think about this room. And the participants are going to end up having two choices. So suppose that everyone in this room were offered in the first treatment, they're offered the following choice. You can get 10 euros, but a mouse is going to get killed. Now, where's the mice coming from? These mice are laboratory mice. All right? Universities tend to have a few of these around. And these little guys have done their duty. They've been in their experiment, and now they're excess mice. So this little experiment is that you can each get your 10 euros, but the mouse is killed. Or you can forgo the 10 euros, and the mouse will be spared to spend the rest of his natural life on that little wheel, keeping in shape. So that's treatment one. It's an individual treatment, okay? Then there's going to be a second experiment where we would divide the subjects in half. So let's say from Thomas on over would be one side and everyone would be the other. And now, instead of individuals making a decision each individually, we're going to assign property rights to the mouse to everyone in this group. And you're going to negotiate with everyone in that group. So in the market setting, the participants are assigned to be buyers and sellers, and they're going to bargain. So now, say Mary and Christopher here would be bargaining. And what they're bargaining is if they get to split, if they can agree on how to split 20 euros between each of them, they get the money, but the mouse is killed. Or they can agree, they're not going to take any money and the mouse is spared. Okay, so let's think about the first setting as the individual setting, and the second setting is the market. So we'll go to the answers here. So here's what they found. All right. So in the first treatment, more people than not chose to spare the mouse. All right. But still 45% of them said a mouse is a mouse, right? Try the next one. Here we go. But look what happens when we put these same people in markets. That poor guy, the mouse is killed 72% of the time. And not only that, you had to pay individuals 47.5 euros to get 72% of them to kill the mouse. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. That's a mouse, right? But I think the point of this experiment, and this was run many, many times, is that somehow decision-making in markets looks very different than decision-making done by individuals. And what we do in finance is in markets, right? So one of the interesting questions, Martin, we'll move on to the next one, is what makes financial decision-making prone to overlook ethical dimensions, right? And this is where I want to draw on the field of behavioral ethics. Right, it could be that people are innately terrible. Some people are. But I also think that some people, maybe all people, are subject to a variety of behavioral psychological biases, right? One of them is the role of markets. Impersonality prevails, right? Why do engineers build cars, that they know may have safety defects, right? Because the statistical victims don't seem to have the same, salience as actual victims. Sort of the same problem we know in markets. The impersonality takes away the notion that there is actually someone on the other side of a transaction. So as we look at the behavioral ethics, we see a variety of things that helps us maybe understand why finance may be prone to missing out on some of these ethical dimensions. A lot of what we do in finance is now more and more technical and involves not just one person, not one banker saying, here, take this. But, you may have the quant who structures the financial product is not the trader who interacts with the client. There may be a variety of people involved. Now, in economics, the notion of delegated behavior or agency problems is certainly fundamental to a lot of what we look at. And we know it leads to a lot of, again, behavioral things that show up in behavioral ethics. For example, in here you can end up with indirect blindness. That is, who's responsible for making sure this product, what we're making, actually is ethical and not sort of taking advantage of people? Is it the person who sort of set this whole deal up? Is it the person who he said, here, create something that looks like this? Is it everybody? Or is it in fact nobody, right? And do people see what they want to see? Do they see that, hey, I don't know what these people are going to do with it. This is just a product. We know from behavioral ethics that these sorts of problems arise all the time. The other challenge I think we have in finance are the complexity of products in corporate form. I can assure you that as confusing as some of these products are when you read about them, in reality they're often a lot more complicated because journalists really didn't know enough to actually write about what these things actually are. So as a finance professor, there are times I'm absolutely puzzled by some of the things that you see out there. That complexity makes it hard for anybody to figure things out, but so does the complexity of corporate form. I thought it might be fun just to look these numbers up. JP Morgan Chase has 5,688 subsidiaries. Morgan Stanley has 9,713. Some of those are tax subsidiaries that are set up so they don't really count. But financial institutions are stunningly complex organizations. And the ability to try and create the right ethical behavior in that is certainly challenging. So I don't want to be an apologist for finance. Instead, I want us to think about what are some of the things that may account for this behavior so that when we think about how we're going to change it, we have some things to contemplate. So I want to go to a second experiment. This one is more troubling. Right, the first one, the mouse, he's awfully cute, but still. This one is more troubling, and this was also done in Europe. They recruited bankers from a large international bank, and again, they did a variety of repetitions of this. So we're not talking, 20 people. We're talking they do it in several hundreds. They recruited bankers, and again, they randomly assigned them into two groups. This experiment, they take the two groups, say this side and that side, you're in different rooms, and what they do is with one group, remember you're all bankers, with one group they say to them, if we were going to do it here, have you filled out your NCAA poll, who'd you pick, did you go with all the Catholic schools? I've done that the last few years, it's worked really well. Yeah, go Villanova, although I picked Gonzaga this year. But, you talk about, do you have kids, that sort of stuff. This group, you're in another room, talk about what is your current position? What other positions did you have at the bank? What other banks have you worked for? So you remind them of their professional duties, whereas these people are not, right? They're all bankers, okay? Martin? So now what? Now all of you are going to flip coins. You're off in separate little cubicles, you're flipping these coins. And you're going to flip a coin 10 times, And then actually, they have these little laptops, and you report the numbers of heads and tails. And you are told before you start flipping, depending on the trial, a head or a tail could be worth $20 each, and you're told which one is going to be worth the $20. All right, so you're told in this round, you know, depending on how many heads you flip, you'll get $20 a head, and then you report how many heads you get. Okay, seems pretty simple, doesn't it? You're just flipping coins. You're going to report how many heads you get. You get paid $20 for each head. Here's the result. When you remind me I'm a banker, I lie more often. So this is the distribution, and basically what you can see, the control group is in red, and the banker group is on the right side, and the control group is on the left side. And you can see the banker side is more shifted to the left. So somehow, reminding people that they are bankers, they lied more. Now, this is a troubling experiment. It really is. I mean, you know, the mouse one, this one. I think that it speaks to the fact that there can be a very bad culture within the banks themselves. Again, I don't want to go back to saying, remember, these people are all bankers. So I don't think all bankers are bad. I really don't. But what I think this little picture shows is that when you begin to think of yourself within the bank, within your profession, somehow you look at the world differently. And I don't know if any of you have been following what's been going on in Australia. But there, you know, they're major banks. They only have like 4. They sailed through the crisis. Australia looked great. And yet, it's just a nightmare down there. They found out that all the big banks basically were cheating people in their wealth management accounts. They were billing people who were dead. They were, there's one bank down there that is facing 57,000 counts of money laundering. And it's unbelievable what's going on in Australia. It's like, what happened down there? And it led to this. There have been big demonstrations down in Australia. I mean, people have had it with this. So I think the reconsidering the values of finance is certainly, it's a time. We need to think about it. So let me just put the last slide up here, which is, where'd my last slide go? Well, let me tell you what's on my slide. I think he got hidden. My fault. Is he there? Can we get him unhidden? I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. How do we change the values in finance, right? I mean, how do we make people recognize that just because it's in a market doesn't mean that you behave differently than when you're seeing somebody one-on-one? How do we change a culture that says, if you remind me of I'm a banker, I lie more often? Well, I think, again, you know, we need to establish an ethical culture. There's a quote I really enjoy, this one. Some of the millennials like this, and I swear some of them think this is how to behave. The secret of life is honesty and fair play. If you can fake that, you've got it made. We need to get away from that. Now, if you wonder who said these deep words, this is Groucho Marx, right? So you really don't want to be patterning your life after Groucho. But I do think there is this fake it till you make it idea that we need to get rid of. And it's not just the millennials, who personally I really like. I think, you know, the boomers could learn a lot from them. But we need ethical cultures in financial institutions. That bank should be ashamed that that's what happens there. They got to look at that culture. And how do we change cultures in corporations? It's not easy. But we've begun to see things like ethical, you know, a number of boards have begun to add ethics committees. Citibank now has one, where it's now a board level problem to create the right culture. You know, when I talk with financial institutions, they say to me, well, you know, what are you doing to change the way the people we hire are? And I agree with that. I think the universities and the business schools have an obligation to do this. We need to rethink compensation schedules, too. One of the things behavioral economics also shows is that people view acts of commission as being far worse than acts of omission. So if I tell you really bad advice, well, that's very bad. But if I know something's crummy and I don't tell it to you, well, should have asked. You know, we don't believe that, right? It's what I've done and what I've failed to do. We need to get that into how we operate in finance. And again, we have to come back and establish finance as a force for good. I know that far too few people think that we are, and maybe those of us who think it is true are delusional. But these are the values that we have to change. That finance is not just, lying to people and making money, because it isn't. But we have to work at that. So let me quit there, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Eminence, Excellencies. It's a great honor for me to be here and to be invited here of the Institute of Lumen Christi, and I'm glad to be here once more in behalf of our institute, and also in behalf of explaining something about our theme, the values of finance, with the background of our document, Economicae et Pecuniarie Questiones. We have already spoken a little bit yesterday afternoon and evening, and in my point I want to make 3 points. As we have learned it from the Jesuits at the Gregorian University in Rome, I have no PowerPoint. I excuse myself, I have no PowerPoint. We haven't learned it during the 80s at the Gregorian in Rome, so I can only make 3 or 4 or 5 points, and I will make 3 points or 4 points. First, a short view to values and goods, then second, a short point of biblical anthropology. What does it mean that we are speaking about anthropology? Third point, values of finance. What does it mean with a Christian background? And fourth, some remarks for application. I ask for forgiveness for my German English. My Italian is better, but please take it for the moment. The first, the theme of our part this morning, of our panel this morning, is values of finance. Traditionally, we make difference between values and goods. Normally, or in the mainstream now, at least in Germany, they use these words value and good identically. But in the tradition, we have 2 different meanings. Goods are the objective goods of persons. Values are the subjective goods. So value means that a person, an individual person, says, this good is good for me. Goods in itself, life, family, not to be lied, to seek for the truth, property, all these, what we call the essence and the nucleus of the natural law. These are objective goods, and it's very fine if objective and subjective goods, so objective goods and subjective values are identical, but must not be. So the idea behind this concept of goods and good is the will and the meaning and the motivation and the intention of individual persons are bounded to objective presuppositions. Vorgaben, presuppositions, you say? Presuppositions, yes. The first of this is life. We could make an excursus or a link now and think about, but that would be more a spiritual workshop than rather than a financial workshop, and think about that in the most important decision of our life, we wouldn't be asked. We wasn't be asked that we are alive. we come to world and we think after some weeks, some months, that's the very best idea that you are here. It's a nice idea for meditating in the land, especially. Perhaps you know the famous German-Italian theologian Romano Guardini. He has written a little booklet about it, the acceptance of myself. That's the first task of everyone, not only to accept that I'm here, but to love that I'm here. And we learn it from the love of Mama and Papa, of the parents. So that's I wanted only to remark that is in this perspective, Christian perspective, that's the first good of every man. Not only to tolerate that I'm here, but to desire that I'm here. We came back to this very, very special and important word, desire. That's the Greek word eros. It's the best idea that I'm here, and the best idea for everyone that he's here. That's the nucleus of the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant. So the goods the goods have one source, one root, and the root is the good, the common good, and the common good is justice. Yesterday evening, with the speech of Cardinal Turkson, we have also already touched this very, very, very important keyword of the Western ethics, justice, and the first source, the first moment appearing this word justice is in Plato, the myth of Gorgias, and in the pre-last chapter of the Gorgias in Plato, Socrates wants to explain to Callicles, his dialogue partner, wants to explain to Callicles what is the essence of human being. And the essence of human being, in opposite to a turtle or in opposite to a plant, to an oak, but normally Socrates is speaking of a turtle, the opposite of a human being. So in opposite to a turtle, human being has a soul, an immortal soul. And then he's explaining what is this soul. And he is saying at the end of the life, every person is dying, and the body is gone away after 50, 60, 70 years, and the soul is going to the judge. The judge is called, in this Gorgias of Socrates, Radamantis. And this judge is seeing every person, every soul, only the soul, without titles, without importance, believed importance, and so on. Only the soul. And Callicles says, and Socrates is explaining, yes. And now the judge, Radamantis, is seeing that every soul is wounded. Okay? And Callicles is asking why the soul is wounded, every soul, and Socrates explains because every soul during the life was treated not in a just way. And there's the first time the ethical keyword just was not treated in a just way. And Callicles is asking, programmatically, he's asking, what does it mean not to be treated in a just way? That's the key question of the ethical Western concept. And Socrates is responding, she's not treated in a just way when her beauty, her inner beauty, is mislected. In other words, if her inner beauty is not desired by other persons. So the task of the person, for ending this first point, the task of the person is to protect this certain sentiment of every person that this person is desired by other persons. And that we call love. Love in a biblical perspective, and love also, eros, in a Greek perspective. Avoiding now the discussions about the different aspects of eros and love and agape and so on, only for sketching here the important point. So the first and most important part of every human being is to protect the certainty that I and every other human person is desired. And that means the concept of person, to having a soul and to be protected. Both is important. So justice and dignity. This beauty, inner beauty of a soul, it's a very famous Platonic concept, inner beauty of a soul, that is translated then in the Stoic Latin language with dignitas, and then dignity, and in German we have this famous, or this curious, funny word, Würde. It's an old German word, and we have not the dignity as all the other languages in the Western tradition. But Würde is the same, and then we have also the very famous and beautiful word, Liebenswürdigkeit. So means dignus, loveworthiness, yeah, loveworthiness. Also, that would be a nice link for Lent, to think about what is loveworthiness. Yeah, Liebenswürdigkeit. It's I mention this word only because it's very, 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 very important for the concept of Kant, Immanuel Kant. So he says, dignity of a person is loveworthiness, is feeling loveworthiness. Yeah. So that's the first point. That's the good. This good must be done in all our actions. And now, very short, the second point: biblical anthropology is the same with other words. So the human being, the person, is loved by God. For that, we have this image of paradise. It's an old Persian word, paradise, paradaitza, two words in the old Persian concept, means an oasis, a garden in the desert with water, and you have it in the fourth chapter then in St. John's Gospel, the woman at the well, yeah, she is seeking for water, and Jesus is saying, but I can give you a water of life. And there we have the same idea. So the water of life for a human being is to have the feeling that another person wants me and has a desire to live with me. And that's at very first God. So that's the biblical anthropology. And the second pillar of this biblical anthropology is the person. Every human person is guardian for the soul of the other person. John Paul II once, in his encyclical letter Centesimus Annus, said, when is beginning the Christian ethics is beginning with the question to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And Cain is responding, am I the guardian of my brother? And on this question, there's no response, because the whole Old Testament is one only answer to this question. It's clear that you are the guardian. Who else? That means the human person is not an individualistic concept, but a relational person. Am I the guardian of my brother? Yes. And it's not only your brother by blood, but your brother, as the Cardinal said this morning in the homily during the Mass, with a very, very impressive gospel of the wastrel of the rich man and Lazarus. My brother is not only my brother in blood, but every human being, every person. That's a thesis. If you want, that's an ideology. But we think it's a very good ideology. Otherwise would be, as Thomas Hobbes said, homo homini lupus est. That's also possible. And the guardian of the person is now divided in forum internum, forum externum, says St. Augustine. Forum internum, you are the guardian of every other person, but St. Augustine is explaining, after the murder of Abel, after Cain and Abel, we need not only a forum internum, an inner marketplace of virtue, but we need now also an external market forum, an external level of assecuration against aggression. And this assecuration against aggression is the state, status justitiae. In De Civitate Dei, chapter 11, or book 11, he is explaining that precisely now, with Cain and Abel and with the murdering of Abel, is born the necessity of the state, status justitiae, state of justice. And the first justice is to be alive. And the second justice is to be loved. And the second justice is not be secured by the state, only by family, friendship. For that we are saying family is the nucleus of the state. And not the state is the first, but family is the first. And the state has nothing other to do than to protect occasions, possibilities to love each another. So that's a second point. I'm coming further on to the end, but it's a big picture. The third point, values of finance. That was very late in this history of Christianity and Christian spirituality and ethics that we invented. Running out of time. Yeah. Thank you. That we invented the value of finance. Only with the Franciscan ethics and then with the school of Salamanca. We have the preachers of the Franciscan spirituality, and they invented the capitalism. I think to the invention of capitalism by the homilies of St. Bernardine of Siena in Tuscany. We have today still more or less Monte dei Paschi di Siena, one of the first banks. And we have the values of finance, the financial instruments for competition, for enrichment, for profits. That's not bad. But 1400 years after incarnation, they invented it's better to make profit than to go in the convent. In the gospel you are reading, if you want to be perfect, go give all away and be poor. And now they are inventing, if this would be the only way, that would be the right perspective. Now we are inventing, and then with the school of Salamanca, self-interest is not bad, profit is not bad, in a framework of helping the more weak persons. And the last, and I'm coming to the end, is the application. Our document of the Congregation of Faith and the Dicastery for Integral Development of Human Being is more a general document, an anthropological document. The application, I would say, could be at least in two directions. First, to construct spiritual guidance for managers, for persons. Maureen O'Hara has said in the financial system there are persons, but they are bounded to the laws of the financial system. But what we are doing for the persons living there, working there, what we are doing, one point in the document is ethical committees, for instance. That's a mixture form between spiritual guidance and institutional laws. But I think it's very, very important to think about spiritual guidance for entrepreneurs, for persons. And the second, then to think about one point Christopher Giancarlo yesterday evening mentioned. We need competition in a social market economy or in a capitalistic system with responsibility. We need competition and liability. It was very, very, very famous concept in the beginning of the social market economy in Germany. Werner Eucken and also Müller-Armack, they thought a lot about liability, whom we are responsible. Thank you very much for your patience.
Good morning. I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to discuss the values of finance in light of this document. It was a challenging read. I want to start with a quote, which is very rich and talks about what I think are the three primary purposes of finance. Financial activity, the document says, exhibits its primary vocation of service to the real economy. It is called to create value with morally licit means and to favor a dispersion of capital for the purpose of producing a principled circulation of wealth. So what then is this threefold purpose of finance? Well, it starts with a recognition of service. Finance is done by, with, and for people in service of the real economy. And so from a financial perspective, it's to create value. Create value for people. First financially, but also socially and morally. So finance as serving, creating value. Where in markets, this is done in a generally uncoordinated fashion, where the coordination comes from the price mechanism. Second, the quote says, disperse capital for the, okay? I think of that as finance connects. It connects across time. I'm saving now for sending my kids to college. Across place, connecting people from all over the globe to each other. Connecting different people with different purposes, like savers versus lenders, for example. Finance connects and creates value by creating win-wins, where both sides of any transaction, any contract, would benefit. Generally, they can benefit because there's a risk sharing involved. Okay? Or co-insurance. One simple example would be an entrepreneur selling shares in a firm, and that way allowing many people to share the risks of the firm rather than all the risk being on the entrepreneur. The connection means very social. So finance first needs to serve. Second, it's very social, it's very cooperative. And then the third part of the quote is a principled circulation of wealth. I think that is the function of finance, to distribute, to efficiently allocate finance. Every business needs finance, to efficiently allocate finance, capital, where it's most productive. That is competitive. Right? That's about efficiency. That's a competitive mechanism. So finance is very challenging because it combines three, I think, very different things. It combines service to others. It combines recognition of we need to connect, create win-wins, be cooperative, be social, with, thirdly, efficiency, competition. One of the dangers of finance is to inverse this order. Right? To start with thinking about competition and efficiency, and then recognize, yes, generally we also would like to connect people and create win-wins, and then by the invisible hands of the market, we will create value, which very much can happen, At the same time, the challenge is to understand that the ultimate purpose is to create value. You do that through connecting, and then finally, you also care about efficiency and competition. So we care about all three, I would say. The challenge is to make sure that we don't totally invert that and only start thinking about competition. One way I think that I try to convey this threefold purpose of finance to my students, and to perhaps change their thinking a bit, is to talk about the threefold, what I called shared, or if you like, common goods of finance. So think about any financial transaction. Then the first requirement is that both sides of this transaction benefit. Right? So any financial transaction would be subject to transactional justice, justice in exchange, or commutative justice. And that's basically, well, if you do the commutative thing, if you switch sides, it would still be fair. Right? And so if you are doing a transaction, and if you would put yourself in the shoes of the other side, would you still think this is a fair transaction? If not, well, you violate commutative justice. Particularly if you are the party in the transaction with superior information, would you still think it's fair if you are on the other side? But these shared goods of finance go beyond the transaction. Basically, what I would argue is that every financial transaction, if it's morally illicit, also has to provide shared goods to all the other participants in the market. The first one is sharing of information. That others can observe the transaction in the market, they learn from this. If it's a transaction that is an ethical transaction, so are people not trying to hide or fool the market in some sense, or create additional volatility in the market. If the transaction is a good transaction in some sense, that makes the market more efficient, it provides information to the market. It's by observing what others are doing, right, that you have a sense, oh, that is where value is being created. Second, every transaction can facilitate more shared risks. Right? The opposite of that is, the opposite of the win-win, is financial transactions where it's heads I win, tails you lose. Okay? So unless there's a real sense of co-insurance, of sharing risks, right, this shared good is not created. The third thing relates to the third aspect, the third purpose of finance, of efficient competitive allocation, is finance is a way to share discipline. That it's like being in a team. If your team that you're playing with, if they're really, really good, they will make you better. Right? It's going to be harder to play them, but it's actually in the long term good for you to play against really good teams. So by the transaction being bargained hard in some sense, that forces everybody in the market to also bring their best and be well prepared to compete. And that means no crony capitalism, no side deals, no taking advantage of of things that are not about efficient allocation of capital where it's most productive. This is difficult in finance because many times in finance, the person working in finance is at the intersection of serving the economy, of connecting people, and being at the intersection also of efficient allocation of capital. So oftentimes, in finance, we have situations of unequal information, where one party, often in finance, has much superior information. There are many differences in power across the different market participants. We have incomplete markets or incomplete contracting, using economic terms. And there's often unequal control across the different market participants. So there may be somewhat limited competition in particular areas of finance. Those inequalities, which I think are natural, markets help resolve, right, through those shared goods. But there always will be, to some extent, some market imperfections or market inefficiencies, which is why people in finance need to be virtuous. So the challenge then becomes can a person in finance recognize that they have a responsibility to the person they're transacting with, but they also have a responsibility to everyone else participating in the market, that they need to contribute to those shared common goods of finance. Then there's a third element, and that is finance needs to serve the real economy beyond the financial market. Okay? So if we go back to the threefold purpose of finance, we need to serve, we need to cooperate socially by connecting, and we need to compete. So going back to the first, is beyond even the shared goods of finance is this notion that finance needs to serve the real economy. To understand the challenge of finance there, I want to make a distinction between cooperation versus competition, which I think are two different economic mechanisms through which one can create value. So for competition, think markets. For cooperation, think business more generally, or think the real economy, if you like. Competition or markets are characterized by adversarial bargaining, where adversarial doesn't mean you don't like the other person. It just means, well, you're competing. If I sell shares to you, then the more you pay me, the better it is for me, the worse for you. That's all I mean by adversarial. Okay. Cooperation has to start with the recognition of a shared goal. There's really a team approach. Okay. So not adversarial bargaining at the start. Markets generally are characterized by independent transactions, while cooperation is about interdependence. Thinking about it, you're competing in a market. If others in the market are less effective, because they're independent transactions, that makes you more effective. For cooperation, it's the opposite. In true cooperation, there's a real interdependence, so other person's effectiveness makes you more effective. And finally, competition or markets are generally characterized by substitutability. That means in the market, if I'm not selling you something you want or it's not good enough, you go to the next person. In a perfect or close to perfect market, there's many different substitutes for whatever one is buying or selling. In cooperation, again, this is different. It's not about substitutability, it's about complementarities, reciprocity. Willingness to see what the priorities of the other person are, and then having a willingness, because you're recognized, you have a shared purpose, this shared goal, to make their priorities your own. So the challenge in finance then is to be able to do all three things, is to serve, to cooperate, and to compete. So when I think of the students that we try to educate at Notre Dame, and finance is a very big part of our educational programs. Just to give you a sense, in our undergraduate business program, about half the students major in finance. And many of them will go to Wall Street or private equity firms. What do we want those students to think about the purpose of finance? So we want, ideally, to have those students come away from Notre Dame thinking, well, no, finance needs to serve. In finance, we really need to cooperate, but we also need to compete. And ideally, in my mind at least, in that order. Recognizing that's difficult because these are all very different things. They are related. Every business is doing all these three things. Every business is serving, every business is cooperating, and every business is competing. And how to get those three aspects in the right balance, in the right order, recognizing that you're always doing all three. Except, of course, when we have a perfect market. Then it's purely competitive. Then you don't have to worry, in some sense, about cooperation. If there's no asymmetric information, if markets are complete, if there's unlimited or perfect competition, right, then if you're competing in markets, you don't have to worry about cooperation. But if you're not in a perfect market, then you have to worry about these inequalities in information, power, and control. And it is possible that your market transactions may actually hinder the real economy. You may make it harder for the other stakeholders of the firm to cooperate because you're competing so hard. Okay. So to conclude, financial transactions, good finance, if you like, will provide benefits to two groups of people. First, starting at the end, if you like, all participants in the transaction need to benefit, right? Cumulative justice. So don't abuse superior information power and control. How do you know? Well, put yourself simply in the shoes of the person on the other side of any transaction, on the other side of any financial contract. To some extent, I think that's the easy part. 2 and 3, I think, are more difficult. Second, all market participants need to benefit as well. So everybody else participating in the market, and ultimately having a market where everyone can easily participate in. How? Well, because the transaction will contribute to what I call the shared goods of finance. That other market participants learn something important about where value is created by the sharing of information. There's real sharing of risk, co-insurance in the financial transaction, and there's a shared discipline. Right? The efficient allocation of capital makes everyone bring their best game to the market. So that means there is no harm to these shared goods of finance. So no bad speculation that creates a lot of temporary volatility. No underinvestment or risk transfers, where I'm simply creating a lot of volatility to risk shift, right? Assuming that I have the more levered position, so I benefit from risk shifting. No too big to fail or crony capitalism. And then third, that the competitive mechanism doesn't overtake the cooperation that is needed in the real economy of all the different stakeholders, right? Employees, customers, suppliers, communities that they live in, to cooperate fruitfully. The danger there is that too much market pressure, too much focus on competition may undermine cooperation, because these are economically also so very different. Right? The adversarial bargaining versus the team approach, the independent transactions versus interdependence, substitutability versus complementarity. Because of these great differences between competition and cooperation, there's a responsibility on the most powerful financial market participants to recognize that they need to also be cooperative and make sure that all the other stakeholders can fruitfully cooperate in the long term to serve society. Thank you.
Well, we've had 3 stimulating presentations, Maureen and Peter and Martin. It's now time for you all to make comments and questions. We have almost a little more than 20 minutes left in the session.
I puzzled about this as well. And, it is, there are some pluses and minuses, right? I mean, there are people who purposely set out to sabotage things, right? They can do that by writing code. They can do it by themselves. But code is code, right? I mean, in some ways, regulators have an easier time, right? Show me your code. And the code won't, I mean, at some point we may have genetic algorithms that will actually learn to misbehave. I'm actually concerned about that, but we're not there yet. So I don't know. I mean, the impersonality is a problem in markets, and certainly I'm sure Commissioner Giancarlo can tell us that they have been spending a lot of time trying to keep people from programming their trading strategies to purposely destroy markets. But markets have been impersonal for a very, very long time. And like I say, in some ways, having the code be in the market does make you more accountable, right? You can see exactly what you programmed. Don't tell me it was a mistake. You set it up this way. So maybe it helps. I don't know. I'll leave it to my panelists and maybe Commissioner Giancarlo. I think it's a great question.
Thank you. Yeah, no doubt about it. I agree totally. St. Augustine is already saying the state is not, at the first point, an external institution, but must be an internal institution, and then later on, for instance, Romano Guardini and also Joseph Ratzinger in the writings about the institutional ethics, they are saying every person has to internalize the state of a state. So the state is not a totem outside, but the state is the sentiment of responsibility institutionalized in a person against all temptations of short time interest and so on. Der Staat in uns is one title of Romano Guardini, the state in us. So that's a very, very important point, no doubt about. But further on, we have different traditions also in Europe. We have a strong central state institutional ethics. For instance, in France, Colbert, Louis XIV, and so on. And they were piously and devotionally inspired. And then we have the federal system in Germany, for instance, and in Switzerland and in Austria, and the same Vogelsang, also with Catholic background. So we have different traditions, and that's also the problematic. But it's not your main problematic, but the problematic in the European Union now to combine, for instance, the more federal system of Germany and Austria with the more central system of France and Spain with the Franco history in the background. That's a problem. But I would totally agree. There were temptations during the 19th and 20th century in the Catholic social teaching in Europe to divinization of the state. For instance, we have it also a little bit in the encyclical letter Quadragesimo Anno with the so-called Ständestaat. Ständestaat, the state of pillars, yes, the handkerchiefs and the how do you say, the Engelbert Dollfuss, you know Engelbert Dollfuss, in Austria, it was Austrofascism. So they had a Catholic idea of totalitarianism. And nowadays we see, no, that's not the way. The state has to be, perhaps you can say, the state has to be slim fit, strong in a certain way, but in the perspective of subsidiarity. What the private and the civil society can do, it's not to be touched by the state. But that's always, in every case, very hard to define. We have this definition perhaps in the problem of medical assecuration, and we have in some other points, yeah.
There's two ways to provide efficiencies. One is you standardize, you scale, and you sell at mass volume. The other one is to innovate and let many different approaches work and see what is the best way to do this, right? I think what you're suggesting is that mortgages are a very, very basic thing in the economy, which we understand well, and so we should go the first route. We standardize, then you can scale it, and then you sell it to the masses. I think that intuition makes a lot of sense to me for the typical mortgage. I think it gets more complicated when you think about subprime or jumbo loans or more complex commercial real estate transactions. But I think for probably 80% or so of the regular mortgages, but to me that's where the system we kind of have already with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. Although there the problem is, if they I think that one of the issues there was that we had a system with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae that was supposed to be about standardization and scaling up, but then they started to change what they do. Right? They started to keep more and more of the more complex assets on their own portfolio rather than sell them in the open market. They started to lever up. They started to become very profitable and very complex. Right? So how to do this, I think, is very complicated. And then the other thing is, how do you deal with a big part of the market that, let's say, is standard? How does that interact with all the other parts of the market that are much more complex, like the subprime, the very large loans, the commercial real estate?
How important relative to innovation do you think are vested interests in your argument?
Very, right? I think Freddie and Fannie, were diverted from their social purpose because of vested interest. It was very, very profitable to, I think, in my mind, no longer focus on their bread and butter, which is just securitize standard mortgages and not do complicated things. And then the other complication there is that they had a real advantage relative to other banks because they could finance themselves at very cheap rates. And that problem still hasn't been solved.
I think there's one difference here that we need to think a little bit about. I share your view that for a lot of financial products, basic, simple makes a lot of sense. I think part of the challenge here is that people aren't commodities. They actually have very different characteristics, and the biggest one is risk. And so I think, as Martin pointed out correctly, that for many, many people, the standard product is exactly what they need. And if it makes you feel any better, right, Quicken Loans is now allegedly the largest mortgage lender in the United States. Although, to be honest, I find other tables that show that's not true. But for practical purposes, when you do it online, it's pretty basic. It can be done in 5 minutes. The contracts are really easy. So I do think that some of this can be standardized. But there's another solution to this, right, which is think about saving for retirement. I mean, one of the challenges we have in the United States, right, when my parents were in the workforce and looking forward to retirement, they had a pension. They didn't have to do anything. You showed up for work. It all got bigger. Eventually it became fine. You didn't have to invest. Now, people have to actually figure this all out themselves. It is stunningly complicated. So how do we solve that problem? And I think we solve it actually using the legal system, which turns the problem back to your advisor and says, look, you know more than your client, but here's the catch. Everything you advise has to be in the client's best interest, has to be suitable. And if it's not, guess what? You pay for it. I think, suitability has been a feature of financial markets for a long time, and one of the interesting questions is how far should the suitability standard apply? But personally, Werner, I think you raise a great point, right? We need to make it such that financial products are in the interests of the customer and not the interest of the financial institution. And we could standardize, which I think does make sense in many ways, but in other ways, let's draw on the innovation. Let's take all the new and exciting things. But when you're dealing with a customer who can't possibly have the same expertise you do, you're on the hook, not the customer. That would be my response to that problem. I would just say there's one, I agree with you, disclosure is really important, but, the problem with disclosure is if you're a sort of a bad person, there's an easy solution, right? And you can see it in every new IPO offering. There is a prospectus that is, 200 pages long, and 60 pages of them are possible risk events that range from an asteroid hitting the company to, I don't know. They disclose so much that no one can find out what's in there, right? So you're right. The problem is, how do you get it right? The not disclosing is not good. that no problem, you want disclosure, I'll give you disclosure. That doesn't work. So it does come back to how do you disclose the relevant things? And in like housing, we're better about that. If you sell your house and you have a crack in the basement wall, and you know you have a crack in the basement wall, and you don't tell the buyer, guess what? You're liable for the crack in the basement wall. I think we need to be able to do that better in financial products, but I'm not sure how successful we've been.
Yeah, let me also say a couple of words on disclosure. What should we disclose, right? What can be understood? In many cases, it may be sufficient to just explain what it is, right? What the product is. But for more complicated things, I would suggest to ask 3 questions that disclosure should explain. Who benefits from if we do this deal, if this contract is signed? In what ways do the different parties benefit? I think that would be very helpful for everyone to know. Who decides? Who actually has power or can actually change anything here, right? And who pays? If something goes wrong, what happens? Okay. So who benefits, who decides, and who pays? I think that in many ways, for most people who are not very sophisticated, they will understand those terms. And that is not, in my view, how many current disclosure requirements are structured. Right? Oftentimes, I think these are very difficult for people to understand, and they use terms that are also hard to understand. And I think those 3 questions, I think most people will understand. But how to apply that, you still have to be specific about the particular product.